The sound of laughter filled the school hallway again that morning, echoing all the way to the music room. It wasn't cruel on the surface, just the kind of teasing that children think is harmless. But for one girl, those laughs had a sting that never really went away. She was quiet by nature, someone who rarely spoke unless it was necessary. She preferred sitting by the window, sketching small piano keys in her notebook while the others chatted about movies, trends, and weekend plans. Her classmates never understood why she was always drawing the same thing. To them, it was odd, maybe even a little funny. But to her, those tiny sketches meant everything. Every time she drew them, she imagined her fingers moving over real piano keys, producing the kind of sounds that made people close their eyes and forget their worries. That was her dream, to play the piano, to speak through music because words always failed her. But dreams, especially fragile ones, don't always find support. Her family wasn't rich. They lived in a small, simple home with cracked walls and a roof that leaked whenever it rained. Her father worked long hours at a repair shop, and her mother did sewing jobs at home to earn a little extra. They were kind, but they didn't have the money for luxuries. And a piano to them was not just a luxury, it was an impossible wish. She never blamed them. She knew they were doing their best. So instead of asking, she made her own way. One afternoon, she cut pieces of cardboard into strips and drew black and white keys with a marker. She taped them together carefully and placed them on her study table. It looked childish, but to her it was something magical. Every evening she would sit there tapping her fingers on the paper keys, humming softly, pretending she was in front of a grand piano. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even real, but it made her heart happy. One day at school, during music class, the teacher announced that every student would get a turn to try the school's piano. It was an old upright piano that sat in one corner of the room, slightly out of tune but still beautiful to her. When her turn came, she froze. Her classmates started whispering, nudging each other. Some of them giggled, remembering how quiet she always was, how she barely spoke to anyone. The teacher encouraged her with a smile. "Go ahead, let's see what you can do." Her palms were sweaty. Her legs trembled as she walked toward the piano. She sat on the bench, her heart thudding so loud she could almost hear it over the classroom noise. Her fingers hovered above the keys, unsure where to start. She pressed one note, then another, but nothing sounded right. The melody in her head didn't come out the same way on the real keys. The room filled with laughter. Someone shouted, maybe she should go back to drawing her fake piano. The class burst into louder laughs. Her teacher gently stopped them, saying, "Enough, let her try." But the damage was done. Her face turned red. Her fingers stiffened. She hit the wrong keys again, and this time, the laughter turned to clapping and mocking cheers. She quickly stood up, murmured a small "sorry," and walked back to her seat. The teacher didn't scold her, but her expression said everything. It was pity, not belief. That night, she didn't eat much. She went to her room, shut the door, and sat quietly at her table. The cardboard piano was still there, waiting for her. She touched it gently, tracing the keys with her fingers. Then for the first time she felt anger, not at her classmates, but at herself. She thought maybe they were right. Maybe she wasn't meant for this. Maybe it was silly to dream about something that was so far out of reach. But as she sat there, a memory came back to her, one from when she was younger. Her grandmother, who used to hum old songs while cooking, once told her, "Music doesn't need fancy things. It just needs a heart that listens." That sentence echoed in her head that night like a whisper of hope. She took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and pressed her paper keys again. She decided that no matter what anyone said, she would learn. Even if she had no real piano, even if the world laughed, she would find her way through sound. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The school gates were still locked, but she waited patiently outside until the caretaker came. Once the doors opened, she slipped quietly into the empty music room. There it was, the same piano that had made her cry the day before, the same keys that betrayed her shaking fingers. She sat down again, this time with no one watching. The silence gave her courage. She pressed one key slowly, then another. The notes sounded harsh at first, uneven, but she listened carefully, trying to remember what she heard in her imagination. She spent that whole morning experimenting, making mistakes and trying again. When the first bell rang, she quickly left before anyone could see her. And she did the same thing the next day, and the next it became her secret routine. Every morning, while others were still at home eating breakfast or chatting in the courtyard, she sat in that quiet room, teaching herself one note at a time. She didn't have a teacher. She didn't have sheet music. She learned by ear, replaying tunes in her mind and trying to match them. She watched short online videos late at night, memorizing how fingers moved across keys. Then she would repeat it on her cardboard keyboard before practicing it on the real piano in the mornings. The progress was slow, painfully slow. Some days she got frustrated and wanted to give up, but each time she remembered the laughter that echoed around her, something inside pushed her to keep going. Weeks passed. Her hands grew steadier. Her ears started to recognize when a note was right or wrong. The more she played, the more the music began to make sense. She didn't notice it at first, but even her posture changed. The shy girl who once trembled in front of the piano now sat with quiet confidence. At home, her mother noticed the soft humming that had become a part of her evening routine. She smiled and asked, "You seem happy these days?" The girl just nodded, hiding a small grin. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. It wasn't time yet. Sometimes, when she practiced in the music room, she imagined herself in a grand hall, performing for a big audience. In her mind, there were no mocking voices, no laughter, only silence and admiration. It was a beautiful dream, one that kept her going. But despite her secret progress, there were moments when doubt still crept in. She wondered if she was wasting her time, if she'd ever truly be good enough to be respected by the same people who had laughed at her. One afternoon, when she was practicing a melody she had created herself, she didn't realize someone had opened the door. The music teacher stood there quietly listening. The teacher didn't say a word, just watched her play. After a minute, she spoke softly. "That's a lovely tune. Where did you learn it?" The girl jumped in surprise, stuttering, I just practiced a little." The teacher smiled. "You've improved a lot. I didn't expect that." It wasn't much, but those words meant everything to her. For the first time, she felt like someone had noticed her effort. Not out of pity, but respect. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her heart felt light, full of warmth and excitement. She didn't know it yet, but that single moment was the start of something much bigger. The next morning, she returned to the music room with renewed energy. Her fingers moved faster, her confidence grew stronger. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She just wanted to play. Still, she didn't know that her quiet mornings were soon to end. The annual school talent show was coming up, and the sign-up sheet would soon hang outside the principal's office. And that single sheet of paper would test everything she had learned, everything she had fought through, and every ounce of courage she had built. But for now, in that still room, the only sound was music, soft, hesitant, but beautiful. Every note carried a story. Every pause carried a memory, and though the world didn't know it yet, the same girl who once made everyone laugh with her clumsy piano attempt was slowly learning how to make them silent, not with shame, but with awe. The early mornings became her secret world. While most of the school was still asleep, she would walk quietly through the empty streets carrying her small backpack and a thermos of warm tea. The air was cool, and sometimes a light fog covered the road. The sound of her shoes on the pavement was the only thing that broke the silence. She liked it that way. It felt like the world was giving her a few hours that belonged only to her. When she reached the school gate, the guard would smile and open it without asking questions anymore. At first, he had looked at her strangely, wondering why a young student kept coming so early every day. But after a while, he understood she wasn't causing trouble. She was chasing something quietly, something he could see in her eyes even though she never said a word about it. Inside the music room, the light from the small window fell directly on the piano. Dust danced in the sunlight. The air always smelled a little old, like wooden benches and sheet music that hadn't been touched in years. She would wipe the piano gently before sitting down. Then she would close her eyes, take a deep breath, and start to play. At first, her fingers still slipped. The sound was uneven, but she no longer cared if she made mistakes. She had learned that every wrong note was just a step toward the right one. And day by day, something inside her began to change. The piano was no longer just an instrument to her. It became her voice, her comfort, her only true friend. Every time she pressed a key, she remembered that day when the laughter had filled the room. It still hurt, but now it was like fuel. She wanted to prove, not to them, but to herself, that she was capable of more. After a few weeks, she started bringing a small notebook with her. In it, she wrote down the notes she discovered and the melodies she liked. She gave them names like Morning Rain, Quiet Heart, and The Window Song. The notebook became her treasure. Even when her fingers were sore or she felt tired, she would look at it and smile. Each page was a piece of her journey. At home, things were still simple. Her parents didn't know much about her secret practice. They thought she was going early to help the teachers or read in the library. Her mother sometimes worried she was overworking herself. But she never stopped her. As long as her daughter was doing something good, she was happy. Sometimes after dinner, the girl would quietly hum one of her tunes while helping her mother fold clothes. Her father would look up from his chair and ask, "Where did you learn that melody?" She would shrug and say, "I just made it up." He would smile proudly, not realizing that his daughter had been teaching herself to play a real piano for months. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. The girl's progress was slow but steady. She learned how to listen better, not just to the piano but to life around her. She noticed how rain on the window could sound like soft rhythm, how wind through the trees could carry its own music. These small sounds became part of her learning. They taught her that music wasn't just in instruments. It was everywhere. Sometimes she felt lonely. No one knew what she was doing. Her friends at school never noticed her missing before classes. They didn't care enough to ask. She still sat by the window during breaks, sketching or writing notes in her small notebook. A few students whispered about how strange she was, but she didn't mind anymore. She had learned that silence was her best friend. Then one day, the teacher who had once watched her play badly came into the music room early by accident. She stopped at the door and listened quietly. The girl didn't notice her at first. She was lost in a melody, her fingers moving with emotion, her eyes closed. When the teacher finally spoke, it startled her. "You've been practicing," the teacher said softly. "How long have you been doing this?" The girl hesitated, unsure whether she was in trouble. "A few months," she finally said. "I just wanted to get better." The teacher smiled. "Well, it's working. You've improved more than I expected." Those words made her heart race. It was the first real praise she had ever received for her playing. The teacher didn't stay long, but that small encouragement stayed with her for days. It felt like sunlight in a cold room. From that day on, she practiced even harder. She no longer just repeated notes, she played with feeling. She started to imagine stories behind the melodies. One piece she played reminded her of walking in the rain with her grandmother when she was small. Another one reminded her of the day she failed in front of everyone. Each note had a memory behind it, and every sound carried a piece of her heart. But learning without a guide was not easy. There were moments when she hit walls, pieces she couldn't understand, songs she couldn't finish. Her fingers would ache and frustration would fill her chest. There were days when she slammed the piano lid shut and sat there with tears in her eyes. She thought about giving up more times than she could count. But somehow she always came back the next day. She told herself that giving up would mean letting the laughter win. She didn't want that. She wanted to change the memory of that day into something new. One rainy morning, as she played softly, she noticed someone standing at the door again. This time it wasn't the teacher. It was one of the boys from her class. He had been passing by and heard the music. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment listening. When she finally saw him, he smiled awkwardly and said, "That's actually really nice." Then he left before she could reply. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. For the first time, someone from her class had listened without laughing. That little moment gave her a strange mix of joy and nervousness. Maybe, she thought, people could change their minds if she just kept playing. As the days passed, she grew bolder. She played during short breaks when the music room was empty, sometimes even after school when a few students were walking by. Each time she hoped someone might stop and listen, not to her, but to the music. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But she no longer cared about the reaction. What mattered most was how she felt while playing, free, alive, and true to herself. One afternoon, she sat outside on the school steps with her notebook open. She was writing a short tune when the same boy from before came and sat nearby. He asked, "You're really serious about this piano thing, aren't you?" She nodded shyly. He grinned and said, "You know, there's a talent show next month. You should perform." Her eyes widened. "Me? No way." "They'll laugh again," he shrugged. "They might not. You're good now. You should show them." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night she couldn't sleep. The thought of performing in front of everyone again terrified her. But another part of her, deep down, wanted it. She wanted to face that same audience, the same laughter, and change it. She didn't make a decision right away. Instead, she practiced harder than ever. Every morning became more intense. She worked on her timing, her expression, her confidence. The piano keys became a part of her hands, her heartbeat a part of the rhythm. The closer the event came, the more she thought about it. She started imagining what it would be like to stand in front of the whole school again. She remembered how she had once walked to that piano with shaking legs and left the stage in embarrassment. But this time she wanted to walk there with her head high. A few days before the sign-up deadline, she gathered her courage and went to the notice board. The paper announcing the talent show was pinned in the center. Dozens of students had already written their names for singing, dancing, and skits. She stared at the blank line under piano performance. Her heart beat fast. She could almost hear the laughter again in her head. Then she picked up the pen and wrote her name. As she walked away, she didn't feel scared anymore. She felt strangely calm. She had made her choice. That evening, she stayed in the music room until the sun went down. She played one of her favorite melodies, the one she had created herself. The sound filled the empty room, soft and warm like a promise. She smiled quietly. For months she had practiced in silence. Now she was ready to let the silence break, not with laughter, but with music. The announcement of the school's annual talent show spread quickly. Posters went up on walls and students talked excitedly about what they would perform. The corridors buzzed with laughter and plans, dance groups practicing steps, singers humming in corners and actors memorizing lines. Amid all the noise, she quietly walked past the crowd, clutching her notebook close to her chest. Her name was already on the list under the piano performance category. Only a few people had noticed it so far, but soon the whole school would know. By the next morning, whispers began to float around. Someone said, "Did you see who signed up for piano?" Another replied with a laugh, "Oh no, not her again." She heard them, but she didn't react. She had expected it. The memory of the last time she stood at that piano still lived in everyone's mind. For them, she was still the girl who had pressed the wrong keys and made everyone laugh. But this time, she wasn't the same. She wasn't the nervous girl who had run away with tears in her eyes. She was stronger, steadier, and more determined than ever. Still, the fear lingered deep inside her. Every time she thought about standing in front of everyone again, her stomach twisted. What if her hands shook again? What if the same laughter returned? Each morning, she kept practicing before school started. The notes filled the empty music room like gentle waves. The old piano had become her friend. She knew its keys, its small cracks, even the spots where the sound went slightly off tune. She had learned to adjust, to make it part of her rhythm. The teacher sometimes stood outside the door, listening. Once, she said softly, "You're ready." The girl smiled nervously but didn't answer. She wasn't sure if she believed it yet. At home, she stayed quiet about the competition. Her parents didn't know she had signed up. She didn't want to tell them until she was sure she could make them proud. So she practiced silently at night, tapping her fingers on the cardboard keyboard she had once made. The paper was worn now, the keys faded, but she couldn't throw it away. It reminded her how far she had come. As the days passed, the list of performers grew longer. Her classmates laughed and teased each other, but whenever they looked at her, they smirked. "Maybe she'll give us another comedy show," one boy said, and the others chuckled. She smiled faintly and said nothing. Deep down, she knew words wouldn't change their minds. Only music could. A week before the show, the school organized a rehearsal session. Every performer had to play a small part of their act in front of the teacher's panel. Her turn came near the end. When her name was called, a few students exchanged glances, whispering quietly. She walked up to the stage with her notebook in hand. Her steps were steady, but her heart was racing. She sat down on the piano bench, took a deep breath, and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, shaky, but she kept going. The melody flowed gently through the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was heartfelt. She played with her eyes half closed, feeling each note rather than worrying about mistakes. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then one of the teachers clapped lightly. "You've improved a lot," the teacher said. "It's simple but very emotional." She smiled and thanked them softly. As she left the stage, she caught a few students staring, not mocking this time, but surprised. The whispers that followed weren't full of laughter. They were different, more thoughtful. After the rehearsal, she stayed behind to help tidy up. The teacher came over and said, "You have something special in the way you play. Don't let fear take it away during the show." Those words stayed with her. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she kept repeating them in her head. Don't let fear take it away. The next few days were hard. The pressure grew. Everyone talked about the big event, about who would win, who would fail, who would surprise everyone. Her hands sometimes shook during practice. She tried to calm herself, breathing deeply, but the fear kept finding its way back. The morning before the competition, she woke up early and went to the music room one last time. The sunrise peeked through the window as she sat at the piano. She didn't play her performance piece right away. Instead, she just pressed random keys, letting her thoughts wander. She thought about how everything had started. The paper piano, the laughter, the early mornings, the sore fingers, and the small moments of encouragement. Each one had brought her here. Then she whispered quietly to herself, "You can do this." The day of the talent show arrived. The school auditorium was decorated with colorful banners. The stage lights shone brightly and the seats filled up quickly. Students, teachers, and parents gathered, talking excitedly. Backstage, performers prepared nervously. Some danced in small circles to warm up. Others practiced their lines. She sat quietly on a bench, holding her notebook close. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked at the piano from a distance. The same piano, the same stage. But everything else was different now. When her turn approached, her name was announced over the microphone. A few people in the audience laughed softly, remembering that old moment. But she didn't flinch. She stood up, walked calmly to the stage, and took her seat in front of the piano. Her heart pounded. The hall seemed too big, the silence too heavy. She could almost feel hundreds of eyes watching her, waiting for her to fail again. Her palms were sweaty, but she placed them on the keys anyway. The lights dimmed slightly. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes trembled, but then her hands found their rhythm. The sound that came out wasn't loud or grand, it was gentle, deep, and full of emotion. It carried years of silence, struggle, and hidden pain. Slowly, the noise in the hall faded. The whispers stopped. Even the laughter that had started at the back disappeared. Everyone sat still, listening. Her fingers moved gracefully now, telling a story words never could. The melody rose and fell, sometimes soft like a whisper, sometimes strong like a heartbeat. Her eyes stayed closed, lost in the world she had built through music. For a moment, time seemed to stop. When she finally played the last note, it echoed through the hall and faded into silence. She didn't move right away. She kept her hands on the piano, breathing quietly, afraid to look up. Then she heard it. Not laughter, not whispers, but applause. Slow at first, then louder, growing stronger until it filled the entire hall. People stood up. Some clapped, some cheered. She lifted her head slowly, eyes wide in disbelief. The same faces that had once mocked her were now smiling, clapping, even shouting her name. Her teacher stood at the side of the stage, eyes shining with pride. The girl's heart felt full, and not of pride, but of peace. She had finally changed the memory. As she stood and bowed, she noticed something in the crowd. The guard who opened the school gate for her every morning was there, smiling proudly. That small detail almost made her cry. When she left the stage, the same students who had laughed at her months ago came up to her. "That was amazing," one said quietly. "You were really good." She smiled politely and thanked them. She didn't hold any anger. She didn't need to. The music had done what words never could. Later that day, when she walked home, she felt lighter than she ever had. The wind was cool and the sky was turning orange. Every sound around her felt like music. The birds, the rustling trees, even the footsteps on the pavement. That night, she finally told her parents everything. She showed them her notebook and told them about the laughter, the practice, and the performance. Her mother's eyes filled with tears and her father hugged her tightly. "We're proud of you," he said softly. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "I just wanted to prove that I could do it." Her mother said, "You didn't just prove it. You reminded us that quiet people often have the loudest hearts." That night, she placed her notebook beside her bed and stared at her old cardboard piano. She smiled at it, remembering where it all began. The laughter had once broken her heart. But now that same laughter had turned into applause, and though she didn't know it yet, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where her music would no longer hide in silence, but speak to everyone who had ever been afraid to start. After the talent show, something inside her changed. For the first time, she felt what real confidence felt like, not the loud kind that needed attention, but the quiet strength that came from believing in yourself. The applause that night didn't just fill the room, it filled the emptiness she had carried for years. The next morning at school, things were different. The same students who once teased her now greeted her with smiles. Some even stopped to talk to her in the hallway. They told her how beautiful her music was, how it made them emotional. She didn't know what to say. All she could do was smile and thank them. Even the teachers looked at her differently. The music teacher called her to the front of the class and said, "You reminded everyone what true dedication looks like." The class clapped again, and she felt her cheeks turn red. It felt strange and to be noticed, to be appreciated, but it also felt good. At lunch, a few classmates asked if she could teach them how to play simple songs. She laughed nervously, not used to being the center of attention. "I'm still learning myself," she said, but they insisted. So she agreed to show them after school. That afternoon, she sat at the piano surrounded by a small group of students. She showed them how to play basic notes and laughed when they hit the wrong keys. It was the first time she laughed with them instead of sitting quietly in the background. In that moment, she realized something important. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about sharing the joy she had found. At home, her parents noticed her energy. She talked more, smiled more, and even hummed while doing chores. Her father sometimes joked, "Looks like our home has a little musician now." Her mother started saving small amounts of money, hoping one day they could buy her a real piano of her own. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night never faded. People kept talking about her performance. Some said it was the best one the school had seen in years. Others said they still couldn't forget the way she played. One evening, the principal called her to the office. She was nervous, thinking she might have done something wrong. But instead, the principal smiled and said, "You've inspired many students here. We'd like you to perform again, this time at the town's cultural event next month." Her eyes widened. "Me in front of the whole town?" The principal nodded. "You've earned it. Think of it as your next step." She left the office both excited and scared. Playing in front of her school was one thing, but playing in front of strangers, teachers, parents, and people she'd never met, that was much bigger. Still, she couldn't say no. This was another chance to grow. From that day, she began to practice harder than ever before. She spent every spare moment at the piano, learning new songs, improving her technique, and polishing her own melody. The music room became her second home again. Sometimes when she practiced late, the janitor would pause his sweeping and listen quietly from the doorway. "You're going to do great," he'd say. She would smile and nod, grateful for every small word of encouragement. But the closer the performance came, the more nervous she grew. What if she made a mistake? What if this time the crowd didn't like her music? She tried not to think about it, but the worry followed her everywhere. One evening, she sat alone at the piano, struggling to finish a new piece. The notes weren't coming together. Her fingers trembled as she played the same line over and over again, but it still didn't sound right. Frustrated, she dropped her hands and whispered, "Maybe I'm not ready for this." The music teacher, who happened to walk by, stopped and said softly, "You said the same thing before the talent show, remember?" She looked up, surprised. The teacher smiled. "Music isn't about being ready. It's about being real. People will feel what you feel. If you play from your heart, you'll never fail." Those words stayed with her. That night, instead of trying to make the song perfect, she closed her eyes and let her emotions guide her fingers. The music that came out wasn't flawless, but it was full of honesty. For the first time, she didn't care if it was right, no, as it was hers. The day of the town event arrived quickly. The school auditorium looked different this time. It was larger, brighter, and filled with unfamiliar faces. Families from all over the town had come to watch. She could see children running between seats, people chatting, and flashes from cameras. Backstage, she sat quietly, her heart pounding. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her simple dress, neatly tied hair, and nervous eyes stared back. She whispered to herself, "You've done this before. You can do it again." When her name was called, She took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding. She could barely see the audience, but she could feel their presence. She sat at the piano, her hands shaking slightly. The first few seconds felt endless. Then, as soon as her fingers touched the keys, everything else disappeared. She played the melody she had created, the one that carried her journey from the laughter to the applause, from doubt to courage. Each note told a story. Her story. The crowd listened in complete silence. The sound of her music filled every corner of the hall. It was soft at first, then powerful, like waves building up and breaking gently. When the final note faded, there was a moment of stillness. Then once again, the applause came, not from a classroom or a school hall this time, but from hundreds of people standing on their feet. She looked up, eyes shining, and smiled. Somewhere in the crowd, she saw her parents clapping with tears in their eyes. Her mother pressed her hands together as if thanking the universe. Her father stood proud, his eyes wet but glowing. After the show, many people came to congratulate her. Some were local musicians who said she had natural talent. Others were just townspeople who said her music touched their hearts. Among them was a woman who introduced herself as a music academy instructor. She said, "I saw your performance, and I think you have something very special. Have you ever considered professional training?" The girl was speechless. She had dreamed of that for so long, but she never imagined someone would actually offer it. The instructor smiled kindly. "Come visit us sometime. We'd love to help you grow." That night she could barely sleep. She lay in bed replaying everything in her mind, and the applause, the faces, the offer. Her heart was full of gratitude. She thought about how her journey began with a piece of cardboard, some marker lines, and a dream everyone laughed at. Now that same dream had taken her to a stage where people stood in silence, moved by her music. The next morning, she visited the music academy with her parents. It was the first time she had ever seen so many pianos in one place. The sound of students practicing echoed through the halls. She felt nervous again, but excited. The instructor welcomed her warmly and asked her to play something. She sat at one of the grand pianos, smooth, polished, and perfect. For a moment she hesitated. Then she began to play. The sound was richer, clearer than anything she had ever heard. The instructor listened carefully, smiling. When she finished, he said, "You play with emotion, and that's something no one can teach. With training, you can go very far." Her parents couldn't stop smiling. They knew this moment meant more than anything. As she left the academy, she looked up at the sky. The sun was bright and the air smelled fresh. She whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." But deep down, she knew, no matter how far she went, she would never forget where it all started. She would never forget the laughter, the mockery, the pain, and the long mornings in that quiet music room. Because all those moments had shaped her into who she was now, the girl who once failed in front of everyone, but learned to rise through sound. And as she walked home with her parents, she smiled quietly. She wasn't chasing applause anymore. She was chasing the feeling she got every time she touched the piano, the feeling that made the whole world disappear and left only music behind. Months passed after her performance at the town event, but the echoes of that night still lived in her heart. Every time she sat at the piano, she could almost hear the applause again. The sound wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a reminder of how far she had come. Life began to change slowly. The local newspaper published a small article about her, calling her the young pianist who moved a town to silence. People began recognizing her in markets and parks. Some smiled and waved. Others stopped to ask how her music journey was going. It felt strange but warm. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had started training at the music academy. The first few weeks were hard. The other students were faster, more skilled, and seemed more confident. Sometimes she sat quietly in class, wondering if she really belonged there. But every time those thoughts came, she remembered her teacher's words. Music isn't about being ready, it's about being real. So she practiced. Every single day, she would wake up early, help her mother with chores, and then walk to the academy carrying her worn-out bag and notebook. Her fingers often ached from hours of playing, but she never complained. Her mother would sometimes rub her hands gently at night, saying, "Hard work writes its own melody." Her father, who once stayed silent about her dreams, now proudly told everyone he met that his daughter was studying music. He would even record her practice sessions on his old phone and replay them with a smile. At the academy, she met people who shared the same love for music. They practiced together, exchanged notes, and even joked about their mistakes. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. One day, the instructor announced that the academy would be sending 2 students to perform in a national competition. The hall went quiet. Everyone wanted that chance. It wasn't just about winning. It was about being seen, about stepping into a bigger world. The instructor looked around and said, "We'll hold an audition next week. Each of you will play one original piece. Let the music speak for you." The moment she heard that, her heart skipped a beat. An original piece. She had one. The melody she had written from her heart. The one that had changed everything. But could she play it in front of professional judges? That night, she sat by the window watching the stars. She thought about how her journey began. The teasing, the cardboard piano, the small victories. Then she smiled softly and whispered, "I've come too far to be afraid now." For the next few days, she practiced endlessly. Every note had to carry meaning. Every pause had to breathe emotion. She didn't want to impress anyone. She wanted to tell her story through the piano. When the audition day arrived, the room was filled with nervous energy. Students sat in rows, whispering, tuning instruments, and staring at the judges' table. When her turn came, her heart pounded. She took a deep breath and walked to the piano. For a second, she closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw her younger self sitting alone in that empty classroom, trying to play on a piece of cardboard. That memory gave her strength. Then she began to play. The melody started softly, like the sound of a dream just beginning. It built slowly, filled with both sadness and hope. Her fingers moved with ease, carrying the story of her journey, the laughter, the silence, the courage. When she finished, the room stayed still. Then the judges nodded with gentle smiles. One of them wrote something on the paper and said, "Thank you." She walked off the stage quietly, her hands trembling. She didn't know what the result would be, but she felt peace. She had given everything she had. A few days later, the results were announced. The instructor walked into the room with a sheet of paper and said, "The 2 students selected for the national competition are..." He paused for a moment, then read her name. Her classmates clapped and cheered. Some hugged her. She stood frozen for a second, trying to process it. Then tears filled her eyes. She had done it. That evening, when she reached home, her parents were waiting for her. Her father had already heard the news from the instructor. He held her tight and said, "You didn't just play music, you played your heart." Her mother couldn't stop smiling, saying prayers of gratitude. The days leading up to the competition were filled with preparation. The academy arranged extra sessions for her. The instructor guided her through new techniques, and she practiced until her fingers went numb. But the competition was nothing like she had ever experienced before. When she arrived at the auditorium in the big city, everything felt overwhelming. The bright lights, the sound of dozens of instruments being tuned, the crowd filled with professionals. She looked around and saw talented musicians from across the country, confident, polished, and well-prepared. For a moment, doubt returned. She wondered if she truly belonged here. But then she reminded herself of something her mother once said. "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you still move forward even when you are." When her name was called, she walked to the stage. The piano looked enormous under the lights. She sat down, took a deep breath, and placed her hands on the keys. The first note echoed softly through the hall. Then the next followed, and soon her melody filled the space. The music was different this time. Deeper, richer, as if it carried every tear, every smile, every lesson she had ever learned. The crowd listened in silence again. When the final note faded, the room remained still for a few seconds before the applause began, loud, strong, and genuine. After her performance, a few judges came up to her backstage. One of them said, "You have something that can't be taught. You don't just play the piano, you speak through it." Those words stayed with her forever. When the results were announced later that evening, she didn't win first place. But she received a special recognition award for emotional expression through music. To her, that felt even better. Because that was exactly what she had always wanted, to touch hearts. When she returned home, the town welcomed her with open arms. People congratulated her, and the school organized a small event to honor her. Her old classmates, the same ones who once laughed at her, now stood clapping proudly. The principal smiled and said, "You taught us all something important, that true talent doesn't need approval. It just needs belief." As she looked around the room, she saw faces that once looked down on her now filled with respect. And she didn't feel anger or pride, only gratitude. Because without those moments of pain, she would never have found her strength. Years went by and her name became known in more places. She continued to perform, teach, and inspire others who had once been told they weren't good enough. One day she visited her old school again. The building was older, the paint faded, but the music room was still there. She walked in quietly, ran her fingers over the piano, and smiled. A young girl entered carrying a notebook. She looked nervous and said, "Excuse me, are you the one who played here years ago?" She nodded gently. The girl's eyes lit up. "I've heard your story. I want to learn to play too, but people say I'm not good enough." She smiled warmly and said, "Do you know what I used to play on before I had a piano?" The girl shook her head. She laughed softly. "A cardboard box. So don't ever let anyone tell you you're not enough. Music starts here," she said, placing her hand over her heart. The girl smiled, her eyes shining. "Will you teach me?" She nodded. "I'd love to." As the young girl sat at the piano, pressing the keys with awkward fingers, she stood beside her, remembering her own journey. The laughter, the tears, the silence, it had all led her to this moment. The classroom filled with soft notes once again, uncertain but full of hope. And as she watched the little girl trying to play, she felt something deep inside her, the same spark she had felt the first time she touched the piano. The same feeling that had turned laughter into silence. Outside the window, the sun poured in through the glass, lighting up the old room. She closed her eyes and smiled, whispering softly, "Every sound begins with a dream,